You're welcome. All right, counteroffers, contingencies, and more. I mean, what more could you want? So, what more could you want? So, are you, confused by counteroffers? Right? There's, if you go through the Zipforms, you're going to see that there are a lot of different counteroffers. There's the counteroffer, the buyer counteroffer, the multiple counteroffer, the seller counteroffer, the multiple seller counteroffer. They're in 1, 2, 3, 4. There's a whole bunch of them that are numbered, but then when you open them up, the number isn't necessarily there. So the purpose of today was to sort of go through the counteroffers, talk about contingencies and things that are related to that. See if I can get this going. Now, some of this I'm going to, some of this is borrowed from the California Association of Realtors Legal's Q&A, and I'm not going to read the whole thing necessarily, but we're going to look at parts of the form, and this is sort of a guide that you'll have. So one of the questions is, what is the difference between the seller counteroffer and the buyer counteroffer, right? I mean, why not just have a form that says, counteroffer? And the most obvious answer is one is for buyers and one is for sellers, but that doesn't really explain why, right? It just sort of states the obvious. Now, the seller counteroffer has an extra withdrawal provision in item 2C that states that a seller counteroffer is automatically withdrawn if the seller accepts another offer prior to the buyer's acceptance. I was asked this question just yesterday from one of the people that I'm coaching, mentoring, helping out that's on my team. And what happened is that they had gotten an offer. We represented the seller. We had done a seller multiple counter offer to a group of buyers, suitors, as you might want to call them. And then the question is, what happens when we get another offer, right, on the property while those counter offers are out? That is better than anything we're going to get back from them. Can we accept it? And the answer is yes. What about all of those counter offers that are out? There's a multiple counter offer. What about them? Automatically canceled once we accept another offer. So the acceptance, and you're supposed to tell them, we've gone with the sorry guides. There's also an extra paragraph. This is in the seller counter offer entitled Marketing to Other Buyers, which tells the buyer that the seller has the right to keep marketing the property. And again, it reiterates that if they were to get a better deal during this time period, that they could accept it and it would cancel the counteroffer. That's not in the buyer counteroffer. The seller counteroffer also has another box in the first paragraph that allows the seller to counter the purchase agreement by incorporating it by reference. The buyer counteroffer form does not have that box, since a buyer is usually not responding to the seller's presentation of a purchase agreement. In other words, buyer makes the offer, seller counters, and there's a box that says we're including the buyer's offer except for the parts that we're changing. The buyer counteroffer doesn't have that because it's like a tennis match. Now it's on the buyer's side, and they've already made the offer. But other than those picky little differences, well, some of them are they're essentially the same form and used for the same purposes, right? So this is what the seller counteroffer number 1 looks like. Notice it says may not be used as a multiple counteroffer. We're going to talk about multiple counteroffers, but that's coming later. So the beginning part of this, and I'm going to use my little highlighter here. This is the date that you would be making the seller counteroffer. This date over here is the date mentioned in the top left-hand corner of page 1 of the residential purchase agreement, right, where it says dated, right? That's the date that goes in there. And lawyers would say that this is all really important because that's the reference mark that ties all these different forms together. And you put in the address of the property, the name of the buyer, and the name of the seller. Now, let's just go through terms. The terms and conditions of the above reference property are accepted subject to the following. One of the most common things I see written in counteroffers is it'll say, number one, purchase price 2B, 1,400,000. Number two, all contingencies to be removed within 10 days. And then it might say, number three, all other terms and conditions to remain the same. Well, if it makes you feel better to put that last line in, then by all means do it. But isn't that what this first sentence already says? The terms and conditions of the above referenced document, like the purchase agreement, are accepted subject to the following. Now, there are a lot of agents and even some brokers I've heard that says, oh no, you've got to put it in, all other terms and conditions are to remain the same. No, you don't, right? I'm just saying, no, you don't. But if it makes you feel better, right, you might as go ahead. It's not going to really hurt anything. Real estate agents are sometimes, the kind that would wear, both suspenders and a belt, right? But you're basically repeating something that's already been said in the counteroffer. Paragraphs in the offer that require initials by all parties but are not initialed by all parties are excluded from the final agreement unless specifically referenced for inclusion in paragraph 1C, that's down here, of this or another counteroffer or an addendum. What the heck are they talking about, right? What is this? Well, what other than at the bottom of each page of the residential purchase agreement, where it asks for initials, where else does it ask for initials? And the answer is there's two other places. One of them has to do with liquidated damages and the other one has to do with arbitration. Now, what some agents do that are lazy, tiny efficient, right? So the seller gets an offer. The offer, paragraphs in the offer that require initials but are not initialed by all parties, the offer does not include initials for liquidated damages or arbitration or mediation. Now, if we don't say something about that here, then liquidated damages and arbitration mediation are not included as part of the deal, right? It says unless specifically referenced for inclusion in 1C. So I had a seller recently who, knows what they're doing, I guess, right? Not a newbie, a licensed agent. For some reason, I get those. And so she thought it would be better for her as the seller not to have liquidated damages so that she could sue a buyer that broke the contract for more than 3%. And the agent who made the offer, not doing the best job, did not initial liquidated damages. By the time their broker found this out, wanted it to be initialed, it was a little bit late because my client wasn't having anything for it. Now, some people are saying the PDF link doesn't work. Can somebody else verify that it doesn't work? Anybody, let me know. Can somebody else verify me that it's working? It works here. So some people are saying it works and some people are saying it doesn't work. There's nothing I can do about that at this moment, right? If you send an email, everybody that it's not working, send an email right now to me saying, my assistant, her name is Raw, and say, hey, the PDF isn't working, can you send me a copy? And she'll send you a copy, right? But I'm not, I don't know what to do. Right? Is that okay with everybody? See, a lot of people say it's working, so it's not me, it's you, right? Maybe, right? Because there's nothing else we can do but upload it. Send an email, she'll reply, send you a copy. All right. Or you could open up your Zipforms and go find this, right? I'm just saying, right? Because working. Everyone, I don't know. See, a lot of people say it's working. All right. Send me an email. So, all right, that was about that. Unless otherwise agreed in writing, down payment and loan amounts will be adjusted in the same proportion as the original offer, but deposit amounts shall remain unchanged. All right, so let's say the offer is 1.2 million. We counter it. I represent the seller for 1.3 million. Now, if it says you've got an 80% loan with 20% down, then that still is adjusted to 1.3 million, right? It's 80% of 1.3 million, but your original deposit, which was 3% of 1.2, let's say, that does not change unless we type in something that says deposit to be increased to, and if you really want 3%, you have to say something. You have to say something. All right. That's then you could attach. Let me let that go. Some addendum here. We're not going to really get into that right now because I don't really, I don't have any addendum to talk about. Paragraph 2 is expiration. This is where some of the important part is. The seller counteroffer shall be deemed revoked and deposit shall be returned. And there are three ways. One, unless by 5:00 p.m. on the third day after the date is signed. So just like paragraph 31 of the residential purchase agreement, just like that, paragraph 31 of the residential purchase agreement, it has a default of 3 days to accept the counteroffer. Now, as a general rule, 3 days is more time than most people need in order to decide if they're going to take the price or not, right? So you might want to change that. If more than one signature, then the last signature date or by. So that is saying the last person that signs this, whatever date that is. So if seller number 1 signs it today, but seller number 2 signs it tomorrow, it's 3 days from when seller number 2 signed it. But we might want to change it or write in at 5:00 p.m. on and put in another date. Then there's this empty spot here, and this is where you would put in the name of the listing agent. You would put in the name of the listing agent. Right? Because otherwise, if you don't put in, if I'm doing this and I'm the listing agent, I want to put my name in here because this says that acceptance is when I get the buyer's signature on the counteroffer. Otherwise, it has to wait until personally received by the seller. And we don't necessarily know who that is. So this line here is where you would put in your name if you're the listing agent and you're representing the seller and writing this counteroffer. Or, right, remember there's 3 ways in which the counteroffer will die. One is that if the time period it expires. 2, if seller withdraws at any time prior to acceptance. And there's the woo form, which is, of course stands for withdraw of offer form. By the way, it says may be used. Legally, you don't have to use that form. Right now, you might work for a company that's picky and wants to see the form, but I send you an email if you're the agent of the buyer, and I send you an email or text message or call you and say, hey, we're withdrawing our counteroffer. We've withdrawn the counteroffer, right? So the form, may be used, but it doesn't have to be used. Usually email is better because I have tracking software, so I know that they read it, right? We're going to talk about that when they pretend they didn't get something, right? Or it says, this is the 3rd way in which it can expire, if seller accepts another offer prior to buyer's acceptance of the counteroffer, right? And notice we don't necessarily have to tell you at that moment. That would be a good thing to do if I'm the listing agent, to say, hey, letting you know. By the way, I've had this happen where we got an offer, we countered the offer, and then we got another offer that was $50,000 above the counter, right? I immediately called the other agent and said, we've we're revoking, we're withdrawing our counteroffer. We're revoking it because we're going with somebody else. And the agent said, too late, we've already signed it. Right. Now, I said to him two things. I said, number one, I don't believe you. And number two, it doesn't matter anyhow. Because as you're going to see, even if the buyer's agent had their client sign the counteroffer, nothing has changed until they give us a copy, us being the seller side, the listing side, until they give us a copy saying, with every signature on it. Because until they've communicated the acceptance to us in some form, until they've done that, they could change their mind and just throw it away. If the buyer says, hey, we've been thinking about it and we've decided that we really don't want to accept that counter offer, just tell them we reject. That's what would happen. So if we accepted another offer that was higher than the counter, it kills the counter offer unless that counter offer has been accepted prior to buyer's acceptance. Unless it's been accepted and that acceptance has been communicated back to the seller and the listing agent. Here's the paragraph about marketing to other buyers. Seller has the right to continue to offer the property for sale. We don't have to change the status, right, from active to pending because you guys haven't signed the counteroffer yet. Seller has the right to accept any other offer received prior to acceptance of this counteroffer by buyer, as specified in 2A and 5. We're going to get to that. In such event, seller is advised to withdraw the seller counteroffer before accepting another offer. It's safer that way, but in other words, which came first, right? We don't want to get lawyers and go to court to argue about this. So this part where it says seller, if I'm the listing agent, this is where we would have the seller sign it, right? Seller 1, seller 2. Acceptance. So this is where the buyer would sign it. Notice there's this subject to the attached counteroffer. I've had these go back and forth like 6 or 7 times. So the seller says, you know, counteroffer number 1, purchase price 2B 1.3, right? All contingencies to be removed, you know, immediately upon acceptance, right? Buyer said, and there's other things, and then the buyer says, well, we're accepting that, but the purchase price is only going to be 1.25. So if you're countering the counter, right? If you're going to counter the counter, you would check that. And basically it says that all the terms and conditions of the seller's counter will be accepted except the ones that we changed in the counteroffer. And they date and sign it. Confirmation of acceptance. Now, I work with a company that wants to see this, right? And it's always good to get it because you understand just what I've said so far about when was it accepted, when was it communicated back. All of that is why some lawyers drive nice cars, because people are arguing over, well, we accepted and communicated it back before they withdrew it, all that sort of stuff. So this is a place for confirmation, and I'm asked a lot, who is going to be confirming what here? So if this is a seller counteroffer, if I'm the listing agent and I make the seller counteroffer and your buyer accepts it and I get the acceptance back, initialing here, and I can do it. It doesn't have to be done by the seller. I can do it as the listing agent because it says up here, remember in 2A, that were personally received by seller or, right? And that's where you have the listing agent's name. So the listing agent, right, is the seller's authorized agent as specified in 2A, right? That guy, whoever that guy is, can initial it and then date it and time it. Now, and then that way we're sure, right? We made the counteroffer, you accepted the counteroffer, and we've confirmed that we got it. Less reason to hire lawyers and sue each other over the timing. But then notice it goes on to say a binding agreement is created when a copy of a signed acceptance is personally received by seller or seller's authorized agent, you know, whoever's up here. whether or not confirmed in this document. I've been asked many, many times by agents, what if there's no confirmation of acceptance? Does that mean that the contract's no good? And by the way, one reason that brokers are paid to be brokers is simply because many of us, not all, but many of us have actually read the contract, right? Have actually read it. And that confirmation of acceptance is a step not required by law, right? You understand, it's not a requirement. If there's no confirmation of acceptance, that doesn't mean that it isn't a accepted counteroffer, right? But it would be cleaner if that in fact had been initialed. It would be, that's all I'm saying. It would be nicer. It'd be nice. All right. Sequentially keeping track, yeah. So seller makes a counteroffer. That's counteroffer number one. That's pretty easy. Buyer counters the seller's counter. Is the buyer's counteroffer number two, or is the buyer's counter number one because it's the buyer's first counter? Now, the short answer is nobody really knows, and it's not a big deal as long as everybody agrees, right? So according to the California Association of Realtors legal department, it doesn't really matter, right? Sometimes it's 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, but I always number them seller 1, seller 2, seller 3, buyer 1, buyer 2, buyer 3, right? Hopefully you don't have very many more than that. And that's sort of what this is saying. If the seller counteroffer is number 1, is the next buyer counteroffer to be number 1 or number 2? And the answer is whatever you want to do, right? As long as everybody understands what they're doing and they follow the same sequence. I keep the seller counteroffers numbered and the buyer's counteroffers numbered, keep them separate. But this is from the California Association of Realtors. Apparently, they don't care. How does the seller exclude liquidated damages and arbitration provisions from a contract if the buyer has already initialed them? If the seller does not, you see, so the seller is, the buyer initialed them, right? The buyer initialed them when they made the offer, but the seller doesn't want to initial them. Then the seller would write something in. Seller agrees to arbitration as specified in paragraph 17, right? The arbitration clause is, if the seller does not initial either paragraph in the original purchase offer and also writes a counteroffer on the seller counteroffer, but specifically references arbitration in the counteroffer form, the arbitration clause is included in the final agreement, but liquidated damages is not. So what this is saying is, buyer makes their offer. When we counter it, representing the seller, what we're supposed to do on page 10 of the residential purchase agreement, where it says seller acceptance, it then says, there's a box to check, subject to the attached counteroffer. So the buyer, and what that means is, what you're supposed to do if you're the listing agent and the seller is supposed to sign the original offer. Date, sign, date, initial everywhere. But let's say the seller does not want to initial liquidated damages. As I mentioned, I had this recently, doesn't want to, right? So when we send it back, we have not initialed liquidated damages. We haven't. But we reference arbitration, right? Then we've agreed to arbitration, but not liquidated damages. Let's see if that made any sense. Explain liquidated damages. It's when you like spill wine and it goes on your carpet and then it's all. So let me ask you this. If a buyer makes an offer and the buyer does not have a deposit, is the contract a valid contract? Is a contract to purchase real estate valid if there's no deposit, right? Is it valid if there's no deposit? Let's see. I've got a no and I've got a yes. So let me just ask you this. You're sitting in your office and Elon Musk walks in and he says, hey, I saw that listing that you've got, you know, in Los Altos. I'd like to buy it, right? I'd like to buy it. And you're like, oh, ooh, that's nice. And you fire up, you know, Zipforms and you're filling out the contract and you get to the deposit part and you say, Mr. Musk, how much of a deposit are you planning on giving? And he says, we, this is in the royal sense. He said, we don't make deposits. It's only 12 million, right? I'm just going to pay it tomorrow, right? No big deal. How many of you would keep writing that contract? How many of you would keep writing the contract? I would. So, by the way, is a deposit necessary in order to form a binding contract? Let's say you're on a listing appointment and the sellers agreed to list the property with you and you filled out the residential listing agreement and you're walking out and you're looking at it and you're going, oh, I forgot something. You're going to have to write me a check as a deposit towards my commission. Right? Where's the check as a deposit? Is that a thing? Have you ever had a seller give you a deposit check towards your commission? Of course not. Is the listing agreement still a valid listing agreement? And the answer is yes. So a purchase agreement is a valid purchase agreement, whether there's a deposit or not. There's no need to have a deposit legally. So why do we have deposits? Well, the answer is, let's say Elon decides not to go through with the transaction, just decides not to go through with it. So what would the seller do? Well, the seller could sue the buyer for damages for breach of contract. Who wins when sellers sue buyers for damages in a breach of contract? Who wins? And the answer is lawyers win. That's who wins. See, my lawyer always worked on a percentage, you know, arrangement. And he used to say, you know, look, that's fair. Because he says, you know, if we lose, I get nothing. And if we win, you get nothing. Isn't that right? So if we sued Elon Musk for damages, we would have to sue him for actual damages that we lost that we could prove in court. Right? What liquidated damages says, and if you read the paragraph, and by the way, anyhow, what it says, if the amount of damages would be difficult to ascertain, then the parties agree that the amount of the deposit is considered to be the damages. And if the buyer backs out of the contract, the buyer will forfeit their deposit. Why do we have 3%? Because the California Civil Code says that on a 1 to 4 unit owner occupied residential property in California, the maximum amount that a seller can keep as liquidated damages is 3%. So the buyer could make a 7% deposit, but they get 4% back. Tough math. They get 4% back if they breach the contract. That's why we have liquidated damages, so that there would be skin in the game, so to speak, and it'll sting if the buyer backs out without a cause. All right, that's what liquidated damages is. Cool. How do the counter offers adjust the down payment and loan amount? Well, I mentioned this already. If you have an 80% loan and the counter offer raises the price from 1 million to 1.2 million, your loan is automatically adjusted. The down payment is adjusted, but the deposit is not adjusted unless you say so, right? Not adjusted. I think, and then there's a math example, which I don't know. I'm not going to, since I told my liquidated damages story, I don't have time to go through the arithmetic, but you get the idea. Whatever the ratio is of loan is the same. And, you know, some people say, you know, that it shows your readiness to purchase. There's, you know, I have agents that call me up and they're new agents, right? There's nothing wrong with being new, right? You know, there's two kinds of agents. There are new agents and then there are used agents, right? Something like that. And they'll be looking at the private remarks and they'll ask me, what does EMD stand for? And the answer is earnest money deposit. How can you auto adjust a loan amount if your pre-approval letter does not say that? Well, the contract says, and by the way, typically what we would do, that's a very good question. Because sometimes, there's two ways of asking the loan agent to write the pre-approval letter. One is to give them the price and say, that's what we want, right? Now, the problem with that, right, the upside and the downside are kind of the same side. If your pre-approval letter says you can afford 1.2 and that's it, then what that means is that you might not be able to afford any more than 1.2. See, if I'm the listing agent, how do I take that? Does that mean that that's your ceiling, 1.2, right? Is that your ceiling? Does that mean then that you're not able to take a counteroffer? Or, and then, so if it said, well, my client, is pre-approved for 1.3, see, then the buyer's agent and the buyer may be worried that now we've already told the seller and the listing agent we can afford to pay more. So which one you do you show them that you've got more than you need or less, or just right to the offer amount? That kind of depends upon the market. Now, in the market we're in right now, I don't know if you've heard this, but there's oftentimes multiple offers. People are bidding up. My question is, if you were writing an offer on a property now, would you want to be included in the counter? And as a listing agent, if I see that you can afford more than what you're offering, even if we don't raise the price, I feel better about you, right? I'm feeling better. Because you're qualified for 1.5, we're only talking about 1.3. You've got wiggle room, right, between the price and what you're pre-approved for. So if you write an offer and your pre-approval letter matches that offer to the penny, I might call you unless I've got 20 offers, in which case I might not even bother, right? I might not even bother. I'll just go with one of them, but I might call you and say, look, we're about to counter some of the offers. Would you like, to be included in that, right? And you're probably going to say yes. Then I'm going to say, well, can your client produce a pre-approval letter showing a higher number? Okay, and I'll write that in the counteroffer. That you're going to have to give a verify. And by the way, it already says this in page 2 of the residential purchase contract, which says that within a certain number of days after acceptance, right, the buyer has to give the seller evidence, a pre-approval letter showing that they can afford to buy the property. So if we've raised the price in the counteroffer, that contract paragraph says you're supposed to produce a new pre-approval letter. Right, but I could put that in the counteroffer that says you have to give us a new pre-approval letter by tomorrow. But right now, I would recommend showing that you could do better if you expect to be involved in the counteroffer. Otherwise, I might not even bother with you because, hey, they can't afford anymore, right? The bar has raised and they're out of it. Right? I hope that answered the question. I hope so. I don't know. Can a seller make simultaneous counteroffers to 2 or more buyers? Yes, it's called the seller multiple counteroffer. Now, one of the comments I get from both, listing and selling agents that I work with is, well, we've only gotten one offer, right? We only got one offer. What do you think of the strategy of using the multiple counteroffer just so they think we've got a bunch of offers, and that might, toughen them up and they might be willing to give us a better price? What do you think of that strategy? And related to that question is usually the question, do we have to prove that we have other offers, right? Are we required to show, like page 1 of the RPA from a bunch of them? Are we required to do that? The answer is no. And my advice on whether you should say you have multiple offers when you don't have multiple offers involves 2 thoughts. Number 1, It's better not to lie, especially when it comes to contracts and things like that. I'm just saying it's a good idea to maybe avoid that as a strategy. And number two, it can backfire. Because if you've only got one offer, there's only one fish nibbling on this hook, then the downside is that by telling them that you have a multiple counteroffer, when you don't, they may just go away and they may say, oh, wow, well, that was the best price we could do. And man, if there's we don't want to bid a bunch of, and then they go away. Now what, right? What have you accomplished? Not much. So the seller multiple counteroffer, and we're going to look at the forms. One of the things about the seller multiple counteroffer, two things, but one of them is you could have, let's say we're countering 5 different offers, our multiple counteroffer could be different 5 times. So for example, your buyer, I like your price, but I don't like your terms. You have an appraisal contingency. So all I'm saying to you is remove your appraisal contingency. Another one has no contingencies, but I don't like their price. So you've got to raise your price, right? They don't have to be the same multiple counteroffer. Some people we might be countering on price. Some people we might be countering on terms. They don't have to be the same. The question I got is, do you like to do multiple counteroffers or work with the best offer? Most listing agents in these days are just going to take the best offer. I'm just telling you my experience. If we had 3 of them that are like all right in the same area, then sometimes, and this is a newer thing, is we would say in the seller multiple counteroffer, number 1, make your best and highest price. So this is basically saying it's a jump ball. We want you 3, right, to come back and tell us how high you can go. Right. So if we had, let's say I had 3 offers and they all were pretty much the same amount and the financing and everything looked about the same and the terms, which means contingencies are about the same, then I might counter all 3 saying make your highest and best offer. If one of them, and is 50 grand over the others, chances are really good we're going to ignore the other ones and take that one, assuming the financing, the contingencies are good. All right. Now, the other thing about, and let me just get to this. The other thing about this is that's different from the seller counteroffer. If we give you a seller counteroffer, you represent the buyer, and your buyer signs it, accepts it, and you communicate it back to me, we have a deal. But if it's a seller multiple counteroffer, just because you guys signed it and sent it back to me, that does not mean we have a deal, right? Because everybody might sign it and send it back to me, right? And then what that means is we get our pick of the litter, right? You know, we get to look at them and say, well, we like this one, we like that one, and pick the one. So just accepting the seller multiple counteroffer does not mean you have a deal. It's not a horse race. If you say, oh my gosh, we're going to sack it right away and send it back to them, now we've got it. No, that doesn't mean you got it. It just means you're the first one to accept it. By the way, a tip, if the seller multiple counteroffer has a price, right, it says 1,250,000. Chances might be that they're giving that price to everybody. Right, they've looked at the top 3 or so and they've picked a price above what everybody's offered and they wrote it in. My suggestion, so if I'm talking to a buyer and that's what we see, my suggestion is I'm going to say, how bad do you want to buy this house? And they say really bad, right? So rather than accepting the multiple counteroffer, what we would do is counter the multiple counteroffer. And what we would counter is we would raise the price. So the multiple counteroffer says 1,250,000. I get the feeling all of us have gotten the $1,250,000 price. We're countering it, and we're saying 1,275,000. See, now if everybody accepts it, everybody else, we're at a higher number. If there's 3 of us and we all accept it and it's all the same price, we don't know if we've got it or not, right? But if we do the counter to the counter, then there's a chance that we're going to buy it. Hope that makes sense. Must the confirmation be signed? No, I already went over that. If you receive it, does that create a binding agreement? Only if in paragraph 2 you put in the name of the listing agent or the listing agent, because we're doing the seller. So the seller multiple counteroffer, this part looks the same. There's nothing to see here. What's different is paragraph 6. And what paragraph 6 says, buyer's acceptance of the seller multiple counteroffer shall be deemed revoked and the deposit, if any, shall be returned unless the seller signs it. All right, wait, is that the part I wanted to say? Binding effect, it's up here. Sorry about that. It's been a long day. The seller is making multiple counteroffers to other prospective buyers on terms that may or may not be the same as in this multiple counteroffer. This multiple counteroffer does not bind seller and buyer unless all of the following occur in the time specified below. Seller signs in paragraph 5, right? Buyer signs in paragraph 7. Seller signs in paragraph 8, that's on the next page. And buyer receives a copy of the multiple counteroffer with all signatures. Prior to the completion of all, notice how they've highlighted that of the following, buyer and seller shall have no duties or obligations for the purchase of the sale of the property. That means they can withdraw and change their mind. So what is, well, paragraph 8, I guess I cut that off, but paragraph 8 is where it would be, it says that the seller has accepted. This will be homework. You can go find paragraph 8. Contingencies, how am I doing? What happens if the buyer doesn't remove a contingency? All right, I'm going to go through this a little bit quickly. What can the seller do? So it says that the buyer has 10 days to remove all of their contingencies. 10 days have come and gone. The buyer isn't doing it. What happens? Does it mean that it's automatically canceled? Does it mean, yes, the seller's signature is evidence of the acceptance? That you can look at that tomorrow. So what does it mean, right? So the buyer does not remove their contingencies on time, right? You called them up, you asked nicely, they just didn't do it. What happens? Does that mean the contract is automatically canceled just because the buyer didn't perform within 10 days? And the answer is no, that's not what it means. It's not what it means, right? Because a contingency, by the way, just so you understand, it is like an escape hatch, right? It's like being in a boat and the boat's getting on water and there's escape hatches. Every time you remove a contingency, you've nailed shut one of the escape hatches. Right, so if you don't, so these are just some examples of contingencies. I'm gonna have to move on to the good part. So if the buyer cancels on the basis of an open contingency, so it says the buyer's contract is contingent upon the property appraising and it doesn't appraise, the buyer cancels based on that. The buyer gets their deposit back. They're under no obligation to buy the property. The condition has to either be met or waived. See, that's the thing about contingencies, met or waived. So if the offer is $1 million and it has an appraisal contingency, but it appraises for $975, that doesn't automatically mean that the contract is canceled, right? Because the buyer could look at that and say, it's close enough. I still want to buy the house. And they could go ahead and remove the contingency. They could waive it. Even though it wasn't met, they could still waive it, right? Assuming that they want to go ahead anyhow. Does it give them an unlimited right to cancel? I was talking about this when I was talking about the RPA, where I remember I was going on and on about it has to be in good faith. Right, so saying, like the guy that said, oh, well, the garage was, it said 3-car garage, but it only looks like 2.5 to me. Well, they had already saw that, they saw it on the virtual tour, they saw it when they looked at the property. That was not something that they discovered. That was just something they wanted to use to get out. That's not in good faith, and you might not get your deposit back. If there's a loan contingency, if you don't fill in the details, this is on page 1 of paragraph 3 of the residential purchase agreement. When you get to loan and it asks, what is it, a fixed rate? Is it an adjustable? What is the maximum interest rate? If you don't fill that part out, then it's unclear as to whether or not the loan contingency is tied to a particular interest rate. So this is obviously an old one because I have a very, very high interest rate of 3.5%. But just go with me. Supposing it says in the loan terms 3.5%, but interest rates go up and they can't get 3.5%, then that means that loan contingency has not been met. But let's say the agent who writes the offer doesn't put in anything in that paragraph about the interest rate. It just says loan. So what that could mean, and again, lawyers would get involved if you fought this too hard, what that could mean is that if the buyer can qualify for a loan at any interest rate, then they can't cancel based on the loan contingency. If you want to cap the interest rate that the buyer is going to shoot for, you've got to put that in that paragraph on the first page, right? That's the first page of the residential purchase agreement. Market conditions advisory. This is something you ought to go over with your clients, even though I yesterday made an offer without any contingencies. And what I've actually explained to clients is that, you know, when you read this, it's going to essentially say something different from what we're probably going to do. Now, I've been to a lot of these legal things, and what the lawyers recommend that we as real estate agents do is to allow our clients to lose out repeatedly a few times so that they can self-discover that making an offer with all the contingencies in this market on certain properties is a mistake, and decide on their own. And so I've actually said this to buyers. So what do you want to do? Do you want us to write up some offers that are going to be rejected? And then you'll figure it out on your own? Or, you know, what would you like to do? But they need to understand, and you need to understand what it means to make a non-contingent offer. And the market conditions advisory explains it pretty good. Right, and it says, you know, we're not recommending that you do that, although it kind of looks like we are, right? And the other thing, look at D. At times, buyers may write offers on more than one property, even though the buyer intends only to purchase one. Why not, right? If you're the seller is getting multiple offers, why can't you make multiple offers, right? Why not? Now, it's not illegal, and you don't, as an agent, want to get a reputation, and you have to be careful, technically that's not acting in good faith. But until the buyer puts their deposit into escrow, there's not a whole lot the seller is going to be able to do to you, because remember, liquidated damages, right? There's not much that they're going to be able to do. As a listing agent, I don't change the status of my listing from active to pending until your client has their money in escrow. And I've had buyers agents call me up and say, hey, how come you haven't changed the status of the listing on the MLS? And I'll say, how come your buyer hasn't put their money into escrow, right? When the money is in escrow, I change the status, because sometimes the buyer is writing offers on multiple properties, and I don't want to change the status just to hear, well, they've changed their mind and have to start over. Non-optional contingencies, there is a time period where you're supposed to be able to inspect the property because of lead-based paint. I've never had anybody to do that. By the way, the TDS, if it's delivered after the escrow period, there's a mandatory minimum amount. The buyer has a right to back out, right? And it doesn't matter that the buyer made the offer without any contingencies. If the TDS has not been given to the buyer, they have a right to back out. They just do, right? There's also one, I believe, on the natural hazard disclosure. I believe right. And if they, notice it says, if the NHD is delivered after execution of an offer to purchase, the buyer has 3 days or 5 days, right? Depending on whether or not it was in person. Usually we just say within 5. So that's why if you're representing the seller, you want the TDS in advance, you want the lead-based paint stuff in advance, you want the NHD in advance, you want to give it to the buyer, you want the buyer to sign off that they have received it, because these are non-optional contingencies. Doesn't matter that the buyer's offer said no contingencies. It doesn't matter. They're still contingencies. Can you have no contingencies? Yeah, if you do it right, like I just described. Otherwise, there's still some contingencies. What are the contingencies? I've already suggested you go through the purchase agreement and you highlight every time it says contingency, right? But if you want a cheat sheet, this is from the contingency removal form, paragraph A. There's the list of them, and it tells you where you could find them. So in addition, there's on page 2 an appraisal contingency. This is page 2 of the residential purchase agreement. There's also a loan contingency on page 2, and a little bit below it, I don't think I marked it there, would be the sale of property contingency, right? And condition of the property, this is paragraph 11, I guess, says that it's as is. And paragraph 12 is the one that says buyer's acceptance of the condition of and any other matter affecting the property is a contingency of this agreement. That's the big one, right? Everybody understand? That's the big one, right? And if you're removing contingencies, that's a good one. So other than the contingencies mentioned on page 2 of the residential purchase agreement, all of the other contingencies are all tied to paragraph 14B. And if you've got those contingencies, 17 days is probably too long, right, in this market. And again, this is why the listing agent and the seller ought to get all the inspections, all the reports, get everything done and have it in advance. Close of escrow. So this is just, I'm not going to go through this. I've sort of explained it, but the buyer doesn't remove their contingencies on time. What happens? You have to give the buyer a notice to perform. That's down here. Can you explain the bad one again? The bad one. The bad one. The big one is on page 2, there are 3 contingencies: appraisal, loan, and the bad one, that may have been the word I used, is the one that says our offer is contingent upon us selling our other house. Right? That's one that's, unless this house has been on the market for 100 days, it's less likely that they're going to go for it. Right? That may have been what I said. It was a long time ago. I don't remember. So this talks about what happens if the buyer does not remove the contingencies. The seller has the right to cancel, but only if they first give the buyer a notice to perform. The list of contingencies again. Can I show the list? Contingency removal form, paragraph A. Right, contingency removal form, paragraph A. That's where this came from, right? And I think this is coming up again. See down here, removal of contingencies, right? Removal. When should the listing agent give the NHD and other mandatory contingencies to the buyer? You should give them everything: the TDS, the SPQ, the AVID, the NHD, all of that stuff ought to be in a position where the buyer and the buyer's agent can get it. The buyer's agent can download it. And when the buyer makes an offer, you want all those things signed by the buyer so that you can prove that you gave them all of that information before they made the offer. That changes the time period. What is TDS? My whole class is kind of TDS. Or wait a second, it means transfer disclosure statement. How about that? Maybe that's what it means, right? Both of those are true. The TDS is the transfer disclosure statement. The SPQ is the seller property questionnaire. All right. And by the way, at some point, you ought to read all of that stuff, right? Read them. Notice to perform. So first of all, if there's a cancellation and everybody agrees, you get your deposit money back. If there's a cancellation and we don't agree, then we either have to come to an agreement, Escrow will sit on the deposit until one of three things happens. The buyer and seller both sign a document releasing it. An arbitrator tells them to release it, or a court tells them to release it, right? One of those three things has to happen, or they're going to just sit on the deposit. What usually happens is that they work out some agreement. Maybe not right away, but going to arbitration and or court requires hiring lawyers. And a lawyer can eat up the amount of the deposit in short order. So, you know, but I've been involved in, I've not me personally, but because of my position in the companies I worked at everything from small claims courts, which is different from this, small claims courts to arbitration and even judicial hearings about this. All right. Contingency removal form, this is where you're going to find the list, right? There's a box to check that says we're removing our contingencies. There are three parts of the contingency removal form, A, B, and C. You don't use as often, right? I don't see that as often. That's where you're removing a particular contingency. Now, it could be more than one, but you're removing them individually. If you're only hanging on to, let's say, appraisal or loan, you would use paragraph B. Paragraph B says all the contingencies are to be removed except. So you're accepting the inspections and the reports and that sort of thing, but you don't want to remove the appraisal. Can I talk about some of the mediation? I'm not today, but sometime, sure. We can talk about mediation and arbitration. I could have a lawyer come and talk. That's why not, right? But why not? So B is if we only have one or two contingencies, right? We only have one or two contingencies, we use paragraph B. And notice condominium and plan development is one of them. Sometimes that is an open contingency simply because the homeowner association hasn't given us a copy of the documents. But what eventually we want to see, we being the seller, is C being checked. And C says, we're done, we removed all the contingencies. Now, what that means is once you've, is not of a non-contingent offer, seller has a home and buyer has inspection contingency, can they back out? So just because the seller has a home inspection, I'll do that one, doesn't mean that you can't get your own inspection and back out and get your deposit back. You still can, but you're going to need to find something in the new inspection that wasn't in the old inspection. Otherwise, there's an argument about not acting in good faith. And then there's the question, is there a way a buyer can get out of a non-contingent offer? Yes, you can always cancel. You can always get out. The question is, will you get your deposit back? Right now, the buyer losing their deposit is not an automatic forfeiture. So just because the buyer removed their contingencies and now can't close, that doesn't mean that the title company is just going to wire the money to the seller, right? It's not that simple. Remember, I said there's only three circumstances when the escrow company is going to release the money to anybody. Buyer and seller must both sign a document, arbitration or a court. And the thing about arbitration, which is a whole nother class, arbitrators don't necessarily have to follow the contract or the law. They get to do whatever they think is right. And if they think that you were bullied and pressured and that the seller wasn't really acting in good faith and that they may not let the seller keep the deposit. I've seen quite a few cases where technically, based on the contract, the buyer should have lost their deposit, but they didn't lose their deposit, or certainly didn't lose all of it. The idea is to know what you're doing and not get into that position if at all possible. Now, so let's do the notice to perform. The buyer has not removed their contingencies. It's been 10 days. And 10 days has come and gone, and the buyer's agent isn't responding, and so now we need to go We need to take it up a notch. So we're going to give the notice to the buyer to perform. Now, this notice gives the buyer 2 days. 2 days, right? Am I going to do that? Buyer gives notice applicable. And so what you would do is you would say, what is it that you didn't remove? Did you not put your deposit in, right? Did you not give us your verification of down payment? Did you not remove your inspection contingency? Or what is it didn't you remove? So whatever it is we want the buyer to do, it's got to be on this list or we have to write it in. Note, this is the important part. If you do not remove the specified contingencies using the appropriate form and take the specified contractual actions indicated in the above within 2, or by the way, the default setting, whatever the contract says is what you have to use here. You can't change it, right? So if the purchase agreement says 2 days, it's 2 days. Now the purchase agreement does allow you to write something in, but this is not something that lawyers would suggest messing with. 2 days after delivery, but no less than the time specified in the agreement. I'll explain what that means. Of the notice to perform, seller may cancel. So it's legal, possible, 2 days before the 10 days is up for us to give the notice to perform. That way, on the day they're supposed to remove the contingencies is the day the notice to perform says you got to remove your contingencies. If we wait till day 10, right, and they don't remove their contingencies and then we give them the notice to perform, they have 2 days from when we gave them the notice to perform. Does that make sense to everybody? Now, some people say, well, could we give it to them like a week in advance? That's what this means, but no less than the time specified in the agreement. So on day 7, you can't say you only got 2 days. No, right? You know. And I guess you could write it, if you did it enough in advance, you could write in 3, but generally this is not something to write stuff in, right? Usually, you know, that's just a little irritating. Does everybody understand that? 2 days. Everybody understand that? I can see all of you, so nod, you understand that, right? Everybody understands? You have 2 days. 2 days, right? Yes, okay, great, right? Pop quiz, right? I hope you've been studying, right? You've been studying, right? Didn't you been studying? Notice to buyer to perform, right? Here's the quiz. If you do not remove the contingencies, right? This is just what we said before, within 2 days. So Thursday, the notice to the buyer to perform is delivered at 4:57 p.m. So the question, then there's Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday happens to be the 4th of July. The question is, what day does the buyer have to perform? Now, go ahead and vote in the chat. By the way, your choices will be posted on the Facebook page with your picture, just to see if you got it right. I get a Tuesday, a Saturday, 24 hours. Wow, Saturday, we're all over the place. Saturday seems to be a winner, but the answer is Tuesday. Why? Because it's because of the definition of days, right? Which is coming up, right? There's a part of the purchase agreement that has definitions, and days for this purpose does not include weekends or legal holidays. It does not include weekends or legal holidays. So we have Friday, Saturday is a weekend, Sunday is a weekend, Monday is a legal holiday, Tuesday is the day. Question number 2. What time on Tuesday does the buyer have to perform? What time? What time? Tricky, 11:59, 5 p.m., end of Tuesday, whatever that means. And the answer is 11:59. Why? Because of the definition of days. And after I do this, we'll be done for today. There's a little thing about a DNA form, which I'm not going to get to. Obviously, because there are a lot of questions about this, I could go through a lot more forms. There's a lot of contact. What does days mean? Days means calendar days. Now, However, after acceptance, right? So calendar days would include weekends. The only time in the purchase agreement it says business days is for the deposit. However, after acceptance, the last date for performance of any act required by this agreement, including close of escrow, shall not include any Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday and shall instead be the next day. That's why Tuesday is the answer. Days after, well, how do we count? If today is, if we did it today, is today day one or tomorrow day one? And the answer, it's tomorrow is day one. And then days after, on the specified event occurs ending at 11:59 p.m. on the final day. So you have until midnight of that final day to perform and remove the contingencies. How long is a day? It's a philosophical question. All right, now there's a little bit more here, but you know, you guys have worn me out, and so there will be another time when we can do this. So that's if any of you out there hearing the sound of my voice, watching my slides, are interested in finding out how you could get actual, real, meaningful help with your real estate transactions, and you're interested in talking to me about coaching, or you would just like to be at a company where you could make more money or that sort of thing, it's a short commercial. Reach out to me, set up a time, and I would like to talk to you about how my coaching program, mentoring program, and other opportunities might help you get more money, make more money, and meet fewer attorneys, right? Knowing how to do this right and having somebody that you could reach out to that answers the phone at night and on weekends and can help you with this sort of stuff, it might be helpful. I'm just saying, it might be helpful. Thank you for participating. Stay safe out there. See you guys next week.